From a young age, she had learned that her face was a problem to be solved. Not because someone had said it in those exact words, but because she felt it in every gesture, every averted glance, every comparison. Growing up being the nice one, the good friend, the smart one, but never the pretty one, was like living with a label that no one directly pinned on you, but everyone expected you to wear with pride. And she carried it for years. At 14, she already knew how to do her makeup like a pro. At 16, she understood angles, lighting, and filters better than any influencer. At 19, she had already decided that her nose was too much, too big, too straight, too noticeable, too much of her. And so she began to dream of the day she could change it. For years, she postponed surgery out of fear of the pain, of judgment, of why did you do that to yourself? But more than anything, fear that it wouldn't work, that she would have the surgery and still feel the same, empty, incomplete, ugly. Because even though the scalpel promised a new version of herself, a deep part of her suspected that this promise wasn't so simple. But the day came. One ordinary night, after an argument with her partner, she looked at her reflection and something inside her broke. Not because of what he said, but because of how she felt looking at herself, as if suddenly she had become convinced that her face was the root of all her problems, that changing it was the only way to start over. That night, she searched for clinics online. She compared prices, she read testimonials, she watched videos, she cried, and she decided, "I'm doing this for myself," she wrote in a note on her phone, as if she wanted to tattoo it on her mind, as if by repeating it enough times it would become true. In the following days, she organized everything: savings, permits, medical appointments, all with a mixture of nerves and excitement. Her family didn't fully understand, but they didn't object. Her friends offered vaguely supportive phrases. If it's going to make you happy. No one asked the essential question, do you really want it, or do you just need it? But perhaps they didn't know how to do it either. On the day of the surgery, she woke up very early. She looked at herself in the mirror and touched her nose one last time, not with tenderness, but with a mixture of contempt and resignation. There was no room for doubt. She wanted to change. She needed to change, because she was convinced that a new face would give her a new life, that when she left the operating room, everything would be easier, that she would finally begin to like herself, to accept herself, to breathe without guilt. She entered the hospital with a light backpack and a heavy heart. As they put the gown on her, she felt like she was saying goodbye to something, but she didn't know exactly what. The nurse was kind, the surgeon professional. Everything seemed in order, rational, clinical, but inside her, something screamed silently. It wasn't a no, nor a yes. It was just a formless question. And if the anesthesia came quickly, so did sleep. And with it, the beginning of a story that wouldn't end as she expected. When she woke up hours later, she was still groggy. Her face was numb, her vision blurred, her mouth dry. The first thing she felt was a tight bandage, then a sharp pain. But what unsettled her most was the feeling that she wasn't herself anymore. She hadn't even seen her new face yet, but she already felt that something had changed forever. The following days were a whirlwind. Pain, swelling, medication, rest, all normal, all as planned. But the discomfort didn't come from the physical. It came from the silence, from the inner voice that no longer knew what to say to itself. Because for years, her mind had been trained to hate her former face. And now, with a new face, she didn't know how to react. She eagerly awaited the day the bandages would be removed. She wanted to see herself. She wanted to confirm that it had all been worth it, that the entire process, the fear, the waiting, the sacrifices, had made sense. And when the doctor finally removed the last pieces of gauze, and she looked at herself in the mirror, he felt no relief, no joy, no acceptance. He felt empty, a void she hadn't foreseen, a rejection she hadn't anticipated. Because the image before her was better, yes, more symmetrical, more proportionate, more in line with standards, but it wasn't hers. It was someone else's face, a face without a story, a face she didn't know. And in that instant, she understood. She didn't want a new face. She wanted to stop hating the one she had, but it was too late. If this story is resonating with you, comment below where you're watching from and what time it is there. Returning home after surgery was like moving into a familiar place that no longer felt like home. Everything was in its place. The furniture, the curtains, the familiar scent of the sheets, but not her. Something had shifted inside, not because of the physical pain, which was bearable, nor because of the bruises that still marked her face, but because of that persistent feeling of being out of place, as if someone else had taken her place without her consent. She spent the first few days avoiding mirrors. She covered them, one by one, as if that could somehow shield her from the confrontation that was already burning inside her chest. She told herself it was part of the process, that she just needed time, that it was a matter of getting used to it. But those words, repeated by doctors, friends, even by herself, didn't manage to quiet the uncomfortable buzzing of dissatisfaction. Outside, the response was immediate. "You look amazing! What a change! You're beautiful." Every message that arrived, every comment, every new glance was a veiled blow, because even though everyone celebrated her improvement, she felt she had lost something she couldn't get back. The connection to her identity. Her face, the same one she once hated, was also the one that told her story. And now, that face was gone. She didn't know how to explain that loss. How could she tell people she missed something she'd spent years trying to erase? How could she confess that by erasing a part of herself, she'd erased much more than a nose? She'd erased memories, gestures, connections. Even the way she smiled had changed. And though others didn't notice, she did. It was like playing a version of herself written by someone else. The surgery, supposedly meant to empower her, became a new source of insecurity. She began avoiding photos. She refused to record videos, to make video calls, to look at herself for too long. Her reflection was no longer a clear enemy. She was a kind stranger, a stranger with her voice, but without her soul. During a conversation with a friend, she tried to explain, "It's not that I look bad. It's just, I don't see myself." But the other woman didn't understand. She told her it was normal, that all women who have surgery go through an adjustment period. Give it a few months. You'll get used to it. And that was the most devastating thing. The idea of getting used to something she didn't love, of resigning herself to a version of herself that hadn't been born of love, but of desperation. She began to isolate herself, not out of whim, but out of fear. Fear that the world would continue celebrating something that, for her, was a loss. Fear of having to feign gratitude for a change that made her feel further from herself. Fear of admitting that, deep down, she hadn't had the surgery to accept herself, but to fit in. One night, while looking through old photos on her phone, she found a picture taken months before her surgery. She was sitting in a coffee shop, her hair pulled back, no makeup, laughing, her face completely relaxed. It wasn't a perfect picture. In fact, she remembered hating it at the time. But that night, she looked at it differently. She saw something in it that she no longer found in the mirror. Presence, authenticity, truth. She wept silently, the screen in her hand, not from nostalgia, but from grief, for having given in to a false promise, for having believed that physical transformation would be enough to heal deep wounds, for having changed her face in search of a version of herself that could only be built from within. And it was there, amidst those tears, that a new question began to emerge. What does it truly mean to accept oneself? I didn't have the answer yet, but for the first time, I was willing to look for it from a different perspective, not through surgery, not through external approval, not through the mold, but from her. Therapy became her only safe place, not because she had all the answers, nor because she could undo what she had done, but because there she didn't need to pretend. She could say, bluntly, what she choked back in other spaces. I look better, but I feel worse. The first time she said it out loud, her therapist simply nodded. He didn't offer any motivational words or try to correct her perception. He just let her sit with the pain, and that, strangely enough, was a relief. Through the sessions, they began to reconstruct the emotional map that led her to the operating room. They talked about her childhood, her mother obsessed with aesthetics, and the small but sharp comments that accumulated like invisible wounds. With that nose, you'll never get a boyfriend. You have nice skin, but if you had surgery, your sister inherited the beauty, you inherited the intelligence. Isolated phrases said in different contexts that had become entrenched in her mind like immutable truths. They also talked about love, about how she fell in love with people who reinforced that feeling of lack, about how she got used to accepting emotional crumbs in exchange for company, about how, at some point, she began to think that an external change would be the only way to receive unconditional affection. "Why did you think a new face would give you love?" the therapist asked in one of those sessions, and she didn't know what to answer. She just lowered her gaze, took a deep breath, and murmured, "Because I never learned to give it to myself." It was a harsh phrase, honest, one that stayed with her for days, because she finally understood that the surgery wasn't an act of self-love, but of abandonment, a desperate attempt to be accepted, not for who she was, but for who she thought she should appear to be. Meanwhile, the world kept turning. Those around her treated her with admiration. "You have a different energy," they told her. "You look so confident now." And she nodded, with a smile that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, because that confidence was an act, a learned response, a disguise that was beginning to weigh heavily on her. She began to avoid social gatherings, not out of fear of being judged, but because of the exhaustion she felt maintaining that image. Every encounter felt like a play where she had to perform the role of the empowered woman, and that role distanced her further and further from her truth. One afternoon, walking through the city, she passed a shop window and saw her reflection. She was distracted, thinking about something else, so the image caught her off guard. For a second, she didn't recognize herself. Literally, she had to blink several times to accept that that face was hers. She felt a pang in her chest, because in that image there was no familiarity, no story, just an edited version of herself, designed to please. That night she wrote in her diary, "I don't hate myself for how I look. I hate myself for believing this was the solution." And in that vein, she found some compassion. It wasn't about rejecting change, nor about finding someone to blame. It was about forgiving herself for not knowing another way to heal, for having sought outside what should have been born within. The next day, she took that phrase to therapy. She read it aloud. The therapist looked at her with a mixture of pride and sadness and said, "That's the beginning of returning. Returning not to her former face, nor to her former life, but to her center, to her truth, to that inner place where, beyond the mirror, she could still rebuild herself." Then a new stage began, that of observing, not judging, not running away, just looking. Her face in the mirror, her body upon waking, her emotions while changing clothes, her reactions to compliments, her silences in photographs. Everything was material for understanding herself, for relearning herself, and in that process, she discovered something unexpected. She didn't want to go back to her old face, not because she liked it more, but because it wasn't about that anymore. It wasn't about choosing between one version and another. It was about finding a third, one that could look at both with respect, one that knew it was neither before nor after, but the meanwhile. That meanwhile it was uncomfortable, yes, but it was also real, human, habitable, and for the first time in a long time she began to feel alive in it. Social media was the last place she dared to show herself, not because she feared judgment, she was already used to it, but because she was terrified of confirming a suspicion she had harbored since the day of the surgery, that what was better for others was a loss for her. For years, her social media profiles had been showcases where she displayed carefully curated versions of herself. Selfies with subtle filters, motivational quotes, poses that masked insecurities. But after the surgery, she couldn't even maintain that. She took photos. She deleted them. She tried to edit. Nothing worked. Her new face had no familiar angles. It had no language. It was as if she had forgotten how to inhabit it. One day, she posted a picture, a selfie in front of the mirror, without makeup. She accompanied it with a brief text. There isn't always a success story behind a visible change. It wasn't a full confession, but it was a crack, a way to test how her truth would resonate in that superficial space. The post didn't explode. It didn't go viral. But she received messages that shook her. "Thank you for saying it. I regret it too. I thought I was the only one." It was then that she understood her experience wasn't an isolated case, that many women like her had gone through the same thing, surgery as a hope, and emptiness as the result. She decided to start a notebook just for that, to record those testimonies, those invisible voices that never appear in cosmetic surgery campaigns or on the perfect influencer profiles. Each story that came to him was a variation of his own, some more extreme, others more subtle, but all pierced by the same wound, the belief that the body can resolve what the soul cannot yet name. On one of those writing nights, he remembered the phrase a surgeon had told him before the operation, "You're going to love yourself more." And she understood the perversity of that promise. Because love isn't created with a scalpel. It isn't imposed. It isn't bought. And above all, it isn't born from renouncing a part of who you are. She allowed herself to feel anger against the beauty establishment, against the professionals who sell security as if it were a product, against herself too. But this anger was different from what she usually felt. It wasn't the kind that devoured her from within. It was the kind that compelled her to speak out. She began to write an article, not with the intention of publishing it, but to exercise everything that was burning her up inside. She titled it, "My New Face and I, A Daily Clash." In it, he recounted the small gestures he had lost, the way he wrinkled his nose when he laughed, the expression of astonishment he could no longer imitate, the sad look that helped him identify the exact moment when he should ask for help. It was as if her former face had been her emotional language, and now she had to learn a new one, without a dictionary, without a guide. And that feeling, that sense of displacement, couldn't be fixed with praise or likes. It took time, presence, reconstruction. One afternoon, she decided to return to the place where she'd had her initial consultation, not to complain, nor to seek answers, just to observe. The building was the same, clean, modern, impersonal. In the reception area, the same magazines with identical bodies on the cover. In the waiting room, other young women waited their turn, some nervous, others determined. She sat for a few minutes, without anyone recognizing her. She overheard snippets of conversations. "I just want it to look natural. I don't want to look like someone else, just a little better. My boyfriend says that with a thinner nose, I'm going to break him." Her stomach clenched, not because of them, but because she could recognize herself in each one, because she had said those things too. Because she too had believed that changing something external would resolve her inner turmoil. She left the building without speaking to anyone, but with a newfound certainty. She would no longer remain silent, not for revenge, nor for the need for validation, but because she felt a responsibility to all those who, like her, had gotten lost trying to find themselves. That night, he wrote the first line of something bigger. "I had plastic surgery to accept myself, but I ended up hating myself even more." And as he read it aloud, something in his chest loosened, because naming the pain, at last, began to give her back her power. The human body is wise. It heals silently, rebuilds tissues, reabsorbs bruises. But the mind isn't that efficient, nor is the soul. While the swelling on her face lessened day by day, the internal wound opened a little wider, because every time the mirror reflected a more defined image back to her, she felt herself fading further inside. The hospital discharge came with a smile from the surgeon. "You look perfect." And there, faced with that clinical judgment, she understood how alone she was. Because yes, her face was perfect, symmetrical, proportionate, harmonious, but that didn't bring her back to sleep, nor the connection with her reflection, nor the identity she had lost without realizing it. She began to experience a strange, almost unsettling calm. There was no more external drama, no stitches, no bandages, no checkups. But this apparent tranquility was a disguise. Inside, everything was noise, doubts, discomfort, a kind of chronic disconnection, as if she existed in a skin that didn't quite belong to her. One night, in the throes of insomnia, she got up and turned on the bathroom light. She looked at herself slowly. She observed every new feature. She touched her nose, her cheekbones, her profile, and then she felt it clearly. She didn't hate herself for how she looked, but for what she had lost along the way. That old face, with all its flaws, was hers. It belonged to her. It had witnessed her tears, her laughter, her anger. It had memories. This new one was silence. And in that silence, the shame began to grow. Not only for having had the surgery, but for having believed herself so broken as to need it. For having accepted a narrative that said she had to change to deserve love. For not having trusted herself. For having sold herself to the mirage of aesthetics as redemption. But she also began to feel compassion for that version of herself who, with fear and hope, believed she was doing it out of self-love. Because that was the truth. She didn't do it out of vanity. She did it out of desperation, out of weariness from carrying chronic insecurity, out of a legitimate desire to find peace, even if it was in the wrong place. One afternoon, she received an unexpected message. It was from a former classmate. She said she had seen her posts, that something about them had resonated with her, that she too was about to have surgery, and wasn't sure whether to go through with it. She asked if they could talk. She agreed, somewhat nervously. In that cafe, for the first time, she spoke her mind without restraint. She recounted the excitement, the process, the aftermath that no one notices. She spoke of grief, of missing a face, of the fear of not recognizing herself, not to scare her, nor to dissuade her, only to show her the other side, the side that no one tells you about on social media or in clinics, the raw, intimate, real side. The conversation lasted for hours, and as they said goodbye, his colleague told him something that stuck with him. "Thank you for showing that there is also the other side of the mirror." That phrase stayed with her for weeks, because that's what she wanted to do from then on. Talk about that other side, the one that doesn't appear in advertisements, the one that isn't celebrated with emojis or filters, the one that hurts, but also transforms. She then began to write more frequently, no longer just for herself. She started publishing longer texts, stories, reflections, fragments of her process, not as a victim, but as a narrator, as someone who was no longer afraid to say, "I thought this was going to save me, but it made me fall deeper." And with each text, with each message she received, she felt a part of her being rebuilt. Not her face, not her image, but her voice. That inner voice that for years had been a fearful whisper, and that was now beginning to make itself heard, because perhaps the surgery didn't give her back her self-esteem, but it opened an unexpected door for her, the door to dare to tell the truth. And in that truth, finally, it began to take root. The silence that followed the compliments was the worst noise. She woke one morning to a harsh dose of reality. The physical surgery was over, but the internal reconstruction was only just beginning. Her reflection was improved, yes, more refined by external standards. But every time she blinked, she saw a failed encounter with her true self. The face in the mirror simply returned an empty promise of acceptance, of triumph, of relief that never came. She began to notice the cracks she hadn't seen before, the little lies she told herself before going to sleep. Tomorrow I'm going to feel different. Tomorrow everything is going to change. And these promises were repeated without any new meaning, without any emotional weight, because the physical change was visible, but the internal change, genuine acceptance, peace with her own image, was still missing. One afternoon, while sitting in her room looking through old and recent photos, she realized it wasn't the typical "I don't like myself" that had driven her to have surgery. It was something deeper. She had felt invisible even to herself. Her former face, with all the flaws she had once tried to erase, had been her map, her language, her identity. Now that map had been erased, and she was used to walking around with her eyes closed. She consulted articles about this feeling. She discovered that studies show that while plastic surgery can improve body image, it doesn't automatically guarantee an increase in self-love or identity. Wiadomo-Silikarski.pl+2 Kelly, R. Kunkel, M.D., PA+2. One of these critical studies mentions that mental outcomes depend heavily on the patient's motivation, expectations, and prior emotional health. PubMed +1. That reading brought her profound relief. She wasn't failing. She wasn't the only one who felt this way. It was something more complex. The nights grew long. Instead of sleeping, she would think, "Who is this other face?" Sometimes she cried for no apparent reason. Other times she would simply breathe deeply, listening to the heartbeat that wouldn't stop, just because her nose had changed. Because surgery doesn't change memories, gestures, silences, the desires of a little girl who always wanted to be seen. One morning she decided to go for a walk. No makeup, no filter, just a clean face. She went into her usual cafe, ordered her coffee as usual, and stood watching people go by. She saw women who, perhaps like her, had stories behind their appearance. And for a moment, in that space filled with faces, she felt a quiet connection. She wasn't alone. The cosmetic change had been an attempt at repair, but true healing would come from elsewhere, from recognizing her worth without surgery. When she got home, She opened her notebook. She wrote without stopping, not just accepting me, allowing others to accept me. That simple phrase shook her, because she had been so busy trying to be perfect that she had forgotten what it means to simply be human, with flaws, mistakes, changes, processes. So he wrote a letter to his younger self, a letter he didn't forward. He told her he recognized her, that he was grateful, that he was afraid of losing her, but that he also knew he had to leave her behind to stop running away. And when he finished, he cried, but this time, not for what he didn't have, but for what he was beginning to choose. Because in the end, she understood something fundamental. Plastic surgery didn't bring about her acceptance. It removed the noise of external rejection, but she still had to rebuild her internal dialogue. She had to relearn her face, her voice, her presence in the world. And that reconstruction isn't seen in the mirror. It's felt in the silences that follow admiration. The praise came quickly, too quickly, as if the world had been waiting for her transformation so they could celebrate her. Now you really look like a model. You look incredible. What else are you going to do? You're unrecognizable, in a good way. Every word, every phrase felt like a thorny caress, because behind the "now you really are," she heard everything she hadn't been before, everything that hadn't been enough. She began to notice how people looked at her, at work, on the street, on social media. The attention she had never received before began to arrive with force, and at first, she thought it would make her happy. But happiness didn't come. Instead, a new anguish emerged, the certainty that this recognition wasn't for her. It was for an edited version, for an appearance. One night at a dinner with friends, one of them remarked, "You're so different. I swear you even speak with more confidence." The others nodded. They laughed. But she felt herself sinking, because she wasn't speaking with more confidence. She was speaking with more effort. Every word she said was measured, filtered, designed to maintain the image that everyone was now applauding. She realized that the compliments weren't balms. They were reminders. Reminders that she hadn't been enough before. That love, admiration, desire, all had been postponed until her face fit. And even though no one said it outright, that was the logic hanging in the air. Over time, she developed a physical reaction to praise, a discomfort in her chest, tension in her shoulders, a knot in her stomach. She smiled on the outside, but inside she just wanted to escape, because these weren't acknowledgments. They were validations of a version of herself she hadn't chosen out of love, but out of rejection. One day, a former love from her past contacted her. He wrote, "I saw your photos. You look beautiful. Shall we meet?" She felt a pang, because in another time, she would have dreamed of receiving that message. But now, she only felt anger, not at him, but at herself, for having lived so many years waiting for that kind of validation, for having convinced herself that her worth was tied to a face. He blocked it without replying, and stared at the blank screen for several minutes, thinking, wondering, how many times did I accept emotional crumbs because I believed I wasn't enough? How many times did I stay silent, hide, or change myself to fit in? She began writing those questions in her journal, a new one each night, not to get immediate answers, but to learn how to take charge, because understanding that her surgery wasn't the root of the problem, but a symptom, was a huge step, and a painful one. She began reading about self-esteem, about trauma, about how culture influences the perception of the female body. She discovered that many women live through that same cycle: insecurity, surgery, praise, emptiness, and that very few dared to say it out loud. Then she understood that what hurt wasn't her new face. It was the silence, the inability to express that, despite the change, the pain was still there, more disguised, more hidden, harder to explain, but just as present. She began to rehearse different responses to compliments. Sometimes she would say, "Thank you, but I'm still getting to know myself." Other times, she would simply smile without commitment. And little by little, she stopped seeking approval, because she understood that if her worth depended on external applause, she would always be indebted to herself. And that debt, he no longer wanted to keep paying it. The day she tried to smile in the mirror and didn't recognize her own expression was the day she understood how much she had lost. It wasn't just a matter of aesthetics. It was something much deeper, Her identity had dissolved into an image she couldn't maintain. Every gesture she tried to replicate from her former self felt forced, mechanical, empty, as if her face had forgotten how to feel at home. She began reviewing old videos of herself, talking, laughing, getting angry, crying, not to beat herself up, but to observe from a distance. But what she found wasn't an ugly face. What she found was presence. A woman with a lively expression, with nuances, with genuine emotions. Her new face was technically more beautiful, but it felt like a mask that blocked access to those emotions. And at that breaking point, the real grieving process began. It wasn't easy to explain to others. How do you tell people you miss your old face when everyone is celebrating your improvement? How do you express that your reflection seems fake, even when it better fits the standards? How do you have a conversation about loss when what you lost isn't dead, but edited? The answer was that it couldn't be done. That's why the mourning was silent, personal, intimate. Sometimes she cried in front of the mirror, not out of hatred, not out of rejection, but out of disconnection. Because her face was no longer a language. It was an obstacle, and that made her feel like an actress in her own life. She learned to use certain angles, certain expressions, to pose for photos, to practice looks that seemed authentic, but none of it was real. One night, she dreamed of her former self. In the dream, she found herself on an empty street. The other version smiled at her tenderly, not with judgment, not with resentment, just with presence. She woke up crying, not because of the dream, but because for the first time she understood that she hadn't made peace with that part of herself. She had abandoned her. From that moment on, she began an exercise. Every morning, upon waking, she would sit in front of the mirror for 5 minutes. No makeup, no filter, just her and her reflection, not to correct herself, but to observe herself, to begin building a new connection with that face that, whether she liked it or not, was now part of her story. The process was slow, uncomfortable, sometimes frustrating, but necessary. She discovered that, while she no longer had her former expression, she could create a new one. That gestures aren't just biology, they're also emotion. And that, little by little, if she began to inhabit her face with sincerity, perhaps one day she would stop feeling like a stranger. A somatic therapist suggested she work with her body, breathing, voice, touch. She taught her that the face also holds tension, that often physical rejection resides in the muscle fibers, not the skin. She learned to massage herself, to touch herself gently, and to retrain her expression. And one day, while laughing with a friend on a video call, she felt it, a real laugh, not forced, not staged, a laugh from the gut, from authenticity. And although her reflection was different than before, that emotion was indeed hers. Then she understood. It wasn't about recovering her former self. It was about recovering her ability to inhabit any face with honesty. She no longer wanted to resemble her past self, nor the image she had dreamed of. She wanted to resemble herself, the one in transition, the one who doesn't need to justify herself, the one who feels fear and yet still shows herself, because that's what she missed the most, feeling alive in her face. And that feeling, at last, was beginning to return. "You look fine now. Why are you still so down?" That question, posed innocently by an acquaintance, haunted her for days, because that was the great trap of the process. Everyone thought the problem was solved, that once the desired aesthetic was achieved, everything else, self-esteem, confidence, joy, would follow naturally. But no one had told her the most important thing, that healing the body is not the same as healing the mind, that the physical is only one of many layers. On the outside, everything seemed perfect. Her skin had recovered, the swelling had disappeared, and the internal scars were well concealed beneath a carefully rehearsed expression. But inside, the struggle was more complex. She was beginning to understand that the real battle wasn't against the mirror, but against the narrative that had led her to believe the mirror had the final say. She began to notice something unsettling. The conversations around her increasingly revolved around bodies, surgeries, and cosmetic enhancements. What had once seemed trivial now felt exhausting, as if the whole world were caught up in a silent competition to achieve a perfect version that never arrives, and she no longer wanted to compete. One day, while accompanying a friend to a cosmetic surgery appointment, She overheard the surgeon say, "We sell trust." That phrase stuck with her, because she understood that ultimately, what you buy in surgery isn't beauty. It's a promise, and those promises almost always come with fine print. She left that appointment with a mixture of anger and sadness, not because of her friend, not even because of the doctor, but because she finally saw the cycle clearly. Insecurity, promise of change, external transformation, validation, emptiness, new insecurity, an endless loop. And she had been there. She had lived it. She had fueled it. That day he wrote in his notebook, "I don't want to run away from myself anymore." And that phrase became an anchor, a decision, a way to begin to inhabit oneself from a different place. She began to reduce her social media use. She muted accounts that promoted unattainable bodies and showcased perfect lives based on aesthetics. Instead, she sought out content about body positivity, radical acceptance, and real processes. She started following women who spoke about self-esteem from a place of hurt, not from a place of pretense. In therapy, she explored that long-standing need to constantly improve herself. She discovered it stemmed from childhood, from growing up in an environment where value was tied to performance, appearances, and what could be shown, where being loved was a consequence of being correct, and that, without realizing it, she had carried that logic onto her face. She began writing letters to her inner child. She spoke to her with tenderness, with understanding. She told her that she didn't have to change anything to deserve love, that she wasn't broken, that she was learning. And little by little, that little girl began to appear in her gestures, in her way of walking, lighter, in her way of looking, more sincere, in the gentleness with which she began to treat herself. One morning, she decided to upload an unretouched photo. No makeup, no posing, just her, in her most natural state. The caption read, "My face doesn't define me. My story does." The post didn't go viral, but the messages she received were different, profound. People sharing their own struggles, thanking her for her honesty. And that was enough, because for the first time, what she was showing the world was consistent with what she felt. There was no total peace, no enlightenment, no perfect self-esteem, but there was a new space, the space of truth. And in that space, at last, he began to breathe. The emptiness became more apparent when the echoes of praise began to fade. There were no more new reactions to her posts. No one asked about the surgery anymore. The attention that had initially engulfed her like a whirlwind slowly dissipated, leaving her alone with a silent question. So what now? She had spent much of her life projecting the fantasy that once she reached a certain aesthetic ideal, everything would fall into place. But now that she was there, she understood that the ideal had no defined form. It was a mutating illusion, always demanding more. A thinner nose, a more defined chin, higher cheekbones, an endless chain of improvements that never felt enough. The comments lost their initial sparkle. They even turned cruel. "Now that you've had your nose done, you should think about your lips. A rhinoplasty and you'll be perfect." As if her body were a model under construction. As if each change opened the door to a new one. As if perfection were an attainable goal. She began to notice that her surroundings had changed as well. Some friendships grew colder. Others approached her only to ask about prices, clinics, recommendations. Her experience had been reduced to a technical detail. No one wanted to hear her truth. They only wanted to know how much it cost to look a little more like the standard. That exhausted her. She began to withdraw even more. Not out of shame, but for protection. She could no longer tolerate the outside noise. She needed silence to rediscover herself. During that retreat, she returned to writing. She began to write her story from the beginning, without embellishment, without euphemisms. She started with her earliest memories, her first insecurity, the first comment that affected her deeply, the first time she wished she were someone else. And as she wrote, she discovered patterns, old wounds, repetitions. She understood that she wasn't just seeking acceptance in the present, but also healing from the past. That her decision to have the surgery hadn't stemmed from superficial vanity, but from an emotional wound she'd carried since childhood. A wound made of unspoken words, conditional affections, and averted glances. Writing was her way of rebuilding herself. Each paragraph was a piece of her identity. Not the one from before or after, but a new one. The one from during. the one she had learned through pain to see more deeply. She began sharing snippets in forums, women's communities, and self-care groups. The response was overwhelming, not because of the quantity, but because of the quality. Women from all over shared similar stories, and in those voices she found solace. One of them wrote to him, "Thank you for sharing something I haven't yet dared to say." And that phrase stuck with her, because she understood that her story had value beyond her personal experience. It was a doorway for others, a mirror for those still trapped in the cycle of appearances. She began to build a new way of living with her image, not from a place of correctness, but from one of respect. She stopped taking photos out of obligation. She stopped searching for the good angle. She began to move more freely, to walk without checking her reflection every 5 steps, to speak without thinking about how she looked while doing so. And in that freedom, he found something akin to peace. It wasn't total peace. There were difficult days, moments of doubt, a desire to turn back, but they were no longer abysses. They were merely shadows that I was learning to name, because she understood that the surgery hadn't been a mistake, but neither had it been a solution. It had been another chapter, a necessary one to open her eyes, to realize that acceptance isn't found in an operating room. It's built, it's cultivated, it's honored. And in that new chapter, she was learning to choose herself, every day, even though it still hurt. The process of acceptance wasn't a straight line, but a rocky road full of twists and turns. There were days when I felt I was making progress, when my reflection wasn't an enemy, but a witness. And others when everything became blurred, when memories returned like a tide, dragging along old insecurities, new doubts, and the eternal echo of that unresolved question, who am I now? For years, she had held the idea that self-acceptance was a destination, a place reached through effort, surgery, or discipline. But experience taught her something radically different. Self-acceptance is a living verb. It is a daily practice, an act of presence, even when clarity is lacking. She discovered that the scalpel cannot reconstruct what has not been named, that surgery can change a form, but not the connection with oneself, and that this connection is not created from the mirror, but from silence, from the way one speaks to oneself, from the patience with which one allows oneself to fall and get back up. She began attending support groups for women who had gone through similar experiences. Hearing other voices was eye-opening. Stories of women who had also lost themselves in the process of seeking acceptance. Some cried for noses they missed, others for breasts that didn't feel like their own, many for faces they no longer recognized as theirs. In that space, she found truth. She found home. One day, a woman from the group told him, "I don't regret having the surgery. I regret waiting for it to make me feel good enough." That phrase pierced her heart, because it was exactly what she had experienced. It wasn't about the surgery itself, but about everything she had invested in it. All the hope, all the expectation, all the love that should have been given in another way. Then she began to build new ways of connecting. She looked at herself in the mirror without judgment. She spoke to herself with tenderness. When she felt sadness, she didn't avoid it. She embraced it. And above all, she stopped correcting herself in front of others. She no longer justified her process. She no longer explained why she had the surgery or how she felt now. She simply lived it. One morning, as she was walking through the park, a child looked at her and said, "You have the face of a sad princess." She laughed tenderly, because in that innocent phrase there was a grain of truth. Her face, with its new shape, still bore the sadness of what she had lost, but it no longer bothered her, because she understood that sadness was not the enemy. It was part of grief, part of the journey. She decided to do something symbolic. She printed a photo of her former self, one where she was crying, her eyes swollen, but with an honest expression. She placed it in her journal as a reminder, not to lament, but to honor her history, to not forget who she was and what she had to go through to feel alive again. The process of acceptance wasn't glamorous. It wasn't worthy of social media or celebrations, but it was profound, real, transformative, and that was all I needed. Because in the end, what he discovered was simple and brutal. Acceptance is not achieved. It is practiced. If you breathe, it is chosen. Every day. The story doesn't end with an epic line. There's no final revelation that changes everything. There's just a woman, standing before the mirror, who finally stops searching for perfection and starts searching for herself. Because understanding that her worth lies not in facial symmetry, but in her ability to feel whole even when her reflection seems alien, is the most profound lesson she could have given herself. Today, when someone tells her she looks good, she no longer breaks down inside. She is grateful, yes, but not because that comment validates her existence, but because she has learned that receiving a compliment doesn't define her self-esteem. She has discovered that she can look at herself with compassion, that she can have days of insecurity without it invalidating all her progress, that she can embrace the contradiction, feeling grateful for the change, and at the same time, hurting for what she lost. Because that too is acceptance, ceasing to demand emotional consistency when it comes to human processes. Now, whenever she sees other women talking about surgery, about bodies, about looking better, she doesn't judge. She simply hopes they find their own voice, rather than seeking approval from others, that they choose change from a place of freedom, not from a place of lack, because she knows, deep in her own skin, what it feels like to cross the abyss of no longer recognizing oneself and having to rebuild oneself from scratch. Today she no longer seeks to resemble anyone, not her former self, not the one she dreamed of being. She simply wants to continue being herself. And that, in this world obsessed with the visible, is a radical act of self-love. If this story touched you, comment below where you're watching from and what time it is there. Knowing that other people are healing on the other side also heals me.